Story 1. The Man in the Orange Porch Light. I moved into my grandmother's house in the early fall, right after the funeral. It wasn't sudden. She'd been in and out of the hospital for years, but it still felt strange unlocking the front door without her voice calling from the kitchen. The house was old, wood floors that creaked no matter where you stepped, a screened porch out front where she used to sit in the evenings. Out back, the mountains pressed close, heavy with trees that blocked out most of the horizon. The kind of place where, once the sun dipped behind the ridge, the darkness felt almost alive. The town was small, one main road with a gas station, a post office, and a diner that shut down at 8. People here kept to themselves. They weren't unfriendly, but they weren't eager to invite newcomers in either. Most of my neighbors nodded when we crossed paths, but there was one man across the street who never waved, never spoke. He sat on his porch in an old rocking chair, the boards under it weathered down to a lighter shade. Even during the day, it seemed like that was where he lived, just rocking back and forth, staring at nothing in particular. At night, though, the only light he used wasn't the yellow glow you'd expect from a porch bulb. It was a deep, dim orange. It washed everything in that sickly hue, making his face impossible to read. The first few nights, I barely noticed him. I was busy unpacking, fixing up the place, figuring out how to make it feel like mine. But one night, I couldn't sleep. I'd left my bedroom light off and sat by the window, just looking out at the quiet street. At exactly 2:14 a.m. I remember because I just glanced at my phone. He stopped rocking. Slowly, almost mechanically, he raised his arm and pointed toward my window. It was so deliberate that I froze, my mind trying to make sense of it. Maybe he saw something behind me? I glanced around my dark room, half expecting to see someone there, but it was just me. When I looked back, he was still pointing, completely still except for the wind pushing the hem of his flannel shirt. The next night, it happened again. Same time, same movement. The night after that, too. It didn't matter if I was sitting there or not. If my light was off, I'd catch him in the act, pointing. At first, I thought it might be some odd habit. Maybe he had dementia, or maybe he was drunk and didn't even know I could see him. But the timing was too precise. And it only happened when my bedroom was dark. After a week of this, I decided to leave my light on all night, just to see. The next morning, I peeked through the blinds at his porch. He was rocking again, orange light humming above his head, but his hand rested in his lap. I tried talking to one of the neighbors about him, a woman named May who lived 2 doors down. She just shook her head and said, "That house should have stayed empty." When I asked what she meant, she told me she had to get going and walked away before I could press her. The longer I stayed, the more I noticed things. No one ever went up to his house. No mailman, no delivery trucks. His yard was overgrown except for the narrow path from his front steps to the street. And sometimes, when the wind died down, I swore I could hear the faint sound of his chair rocking long after I'd gone to bed. 2 weeks in, I made up my mind to walk over and ask him what the hell he was doing. I waited until just before midnight, figuring I'd catch him before his strange ritual began. But when I stepped onto his porch, it was empty. The chair was rocking on its own, a slow, steady rhythm like someone had just stood up. The orange light above flickered, casting shadows that seemed to bend in unnatural ways across the boards. I knocked on the door. No answer. I tried again, harder. That's when I noticed something. Every single window, every inch of the doorframe had been boarded from the inside, not just nailed shut, but sealed tight with layers of old, splintered wood. There was no way anyone could see out or in. The rocking chair creaked to a stop. Behind me, the street was dead silent. The kind of silence that makes your heartbeat sound too loud in your ears. I stepped off the porch and backed away, my eyes fixed on that chair. As I reached my own yard, The light above his door went out completely, plunging the porch into darkness. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept my bedroom light on, blinds shut tight, but around 2:14, even with the light on, I thought I heard something faint from across the street. Wood shifting, the slow creak of a rocker starting up again. I haven't tried to talk to him since, and I still don't know if anyone lives in that house at all. Story 2. The smell in Mrs. Ellison's basement. I moved to that town in the summer of '98, a small tucked-away community in the foothills where most folks could trace their family back at least 3 generations. I didn't have roots there, just a new job at the county records office and a modest rental I could afford. The house was nothing special, but it was in a quiet neighborhood with neat yards, big oaks, and a view of the mountains if you stood on the porch and leaned just right. My next-door neighbor was Mrs. Ellison, a white-haired widow who seemed to know everyone. She brought me cornbread my first week, told me which grocery store had the best produce, and invited me to the church potluck even before she'd learned my last name. She had the kind of warmth that made you feel welcome without trying. Still, there was something about her house I noticed almost immediately, an odor that clung to it. Even from her porch you could catch it faintly on damp days. It wasn't overpowering, but it was there, a mix of wet wood, mildew, and something faintly sour, like fruit left too long in the sun. It wasn't the smell of neglect. Her place was tidy as could be, but something deeper, like it came from the bones of the house itself. I chalked it up to age and humidity. Old houses collect smells, and in the Appalachian summer, everything holds onto moisture. Whenever I visited, I tried not to breathe too deeply, though Mrs. Ellison didn't seem to notice. She was always bustling about, pulling pies from the oven, folding laundry, telling me about the church ladies or the weather. One overcast afternoon in early September, she knocked on my door holding a wicker basket of apples. "I've been meaning to clean out my basement," she said, "but these old knees aren't what they used to be. You mind lending a hand for a few minutes?" I told her sure, she'd done enough kindness for me already. The basement door was off the kitchen, a narrow wooden thing with peeling paint. As soon as she opened it, the smell hit harder. It was thicker, heavier, like the air had been trapped for years without moving. We stepped down into the dim light of a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air felt damp on my skin, almost humid, though it hadn't rained in days. Stacks of boxes lined the walls, all neatly labeled in her handwriting. Christmas, books, linens. The concrete floor was cool under my feet, but it was the far wall that caught my eye. The bricks there didn't match the rest. Most of the basement walls were an old, faded red, worn smooth with time. But the far section, maybe 6 feet wide, was built of newer, cleaner bricks, the mortar lighter in color, the edges sharper. They looked like they'd been set not long ago. I must have been staring too long, because Mrs. Ellison's voice floated over my shoulder, calm but deliberate. Those bricks weren't there when I moved in. I turned to look at her. She was standing still at the foot of the stairs, hands folded in front of her, eyes on that wall. The single bulb swung slightly overhead, casting shadows that made the bricks seem to shift. "What was there before?" I asked. She shrugged. "Just the old wall, same as the rest. One morning I came down here and it looked like that." She gave a small laugh that didn't reach her eyes. Probably just the foundation settling or some such. The old owner might have patched it up before I bought the place. Never thought much of it. But the way she lingered on the words made me think she had thought about it more than once. We moved the boxes she'd asked about, just a few to clear space for her canning jars, and I tried not to keep glancing at that wall. When I was done, she thanked me and sent me off with a slice of pie wrapped in foil. The next morning, I noticed her curtains were drawn tight, even though she always opened them by sunrise. By afternoon, Her mailbox was stuffed with the day's letters and flyers. I figured she'd gone out of town, though it seemed sudden. Another day passed, then two. The curtains stayed shut, the mail piled higher. I knocked on her door once, twice, no answer. When I mentioned it at the post office, the clerk just said, "Oh, she'll be fine." Same tone you'd use to wave off a stray dog in the yard, at the diner. When I asked May, the waitress who seemed to know every gossip in town, she looked past me like she hadn't heard. By the end of the week, the grass in her yard had gone untrimmed. The apples she'd left on my counter had gone soft and spotted. That smell, faint but there, seemed to drift even from her closed-up house. One night, walking home from the store, I saw a light in her basement. Just the bare bulb, casting a yellow glow through the narrow, ground-level windows. I stopped at the curb thinking maybe she'd come back. But the rest of the house was dark, still as stone. I don't know what possessed me, but I walked up to her porch and tried the door. It was locked. No sound inside. The next morning, the basement light was off. The smell was stronger. A month later, a for sale sign went up in her yard. The listing stayed for weeks, but no one came to see it, not once. Eventually, the sign came down without the house ever changing hands. And every so often, if I walk past her kitchen window on a cool evening, I swear I see that same dim bulb burning in the basement. I never found out what happened to Mrs. Ellison, but I still think about that wall. Story 3. The Neighbor Who Took Notes. When I first moved into that house on Brookfield Road, I thought I'd lucked out. The rent was low, the view from the back porch looked out over the foothills, and the neighborhood was quiet in the kind of way that made you feel safe. There were only 6 houses lined along that road, all set a good distance apart, with sagging porches and paint sun-faded from too many summers. Folks mostly kept to themselves, but they'd nod when they saw you in town. Directly across from me was a pale green one-story with white trim and gutters that sagged toward the middle. That was Mr. Darnell's place. I met him my first morning there, though met might be too generous a word. I'd been sipping coffee on my porch when I noticed movement in his kitchen window. He sat at a small table right against the glass, the early light hitting the side of his face. His shoulders were hunched slightly forward, pen moving steadily over a black notebook. The blinds were drawn halfway up, just enough for me to see him clearly. He didn't look up, didn't fidget, just wrote like it was the most important thing in the world. It was 6:03 a.m. I remember that because my phone buzzed with a calendar reminder right as I glanced at him. The next day, at the same exact time, there he was, again. Same table, same position, same little black notebook. By the third morning, I'd started to expect it. It became part of my routine. Coffee, porch, and a glimpse of Mr. Darnell scribbling away. I figured it was a diary. Some people keep journals, track the weather, or write down their dreams. Whatever it was, he never missed a day. I lived there nearly a month before we exchanged more than a passing glance. One evening in late April, I took the trash out just as the last bit of daylight was draining from the sky. Mr. Darnell was standing at the end of his driveway, wearing a brown jacket zipped to his neck even though it was a mild spring evening. His hair was neatly combed back, his face pale in the fading light. When I got close enough to nod hello, he stepped forward and held out a small piece of paper. It was torn from a notebook, the edge ragged. On the top was that day's date, written in small, precise handwriting. Below it was a single sentence: "She won't sleep well tonight." I gave a short laugh. "What's this? Some kind of joke?" He didn't answer, just smiled in a way that felt both polite and wrong. The smile stayed on his face a second too long before he turned and walked back to his house without another word. That night, I thought about the note more than I wanted to. I left my bedroom light on later than usual, reading until my eyes felt heavy. At some point, I drifted off, only to wake around 2 a.m. with the sense that something had stirred me. The room was quiet. Then I heard it, a slow creak from the hallway. My bedroom door, which I'd left open, was moving. It was subtle at first, but the gap of darkness between the door and the frame was narrowing, closing inch by inch. I froze, staring at it, too afraid to call out. When it stopped, it only opened a sliver. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I snapped on the lamp and got out of bed, checking the whole house. Doors locked, windows latched, nothing disturbed. I told myself it was the draft, maybe the old wood settling. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, standing in the hallway. The next morning, at 6:03, I looked toward Mr. Darnell's kitchen window. The blinds were closed. No light, no movement. The chair was empty. For the next 3 days, it stayed that way. The blinds didn't move, and his yard went still. No mail was picked up, no car in the driveway. On the 4th morning, the blinds were open again. Mr. Darnell sat at his table, but the black notebook wasn't in front of him. Instead, he was staring straight out the window, straight at me. I looked away quickly, pretending to sip my coffee. When I glanced back a moment later, the chair was empty. That afternoon, I asked a neighbor named May about him. She lived at the far end of the road, the kind of woman who noticed everything. She lowered her voice when she spoke. "You keep to yourself, and you'll be fine. He's been here longer than anyone else. Don't let him start writing about you." "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked. She shook her head. "You'll see." The days got stranger after that. On the following Monday, I found another piece of paper in my mailbox. No envelope, no name, just the date and a line. 3 knocks. Don't answer the third. That night, I lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. At 1:47 a.m., there was a knock at my door. Soft, deliberate. I sat up, every muscle tensed. 30 seconds later, another knock, louder. I stayed frozen. The third knock never came. The next morning, he was at the table again, writing. It went on like that for weeks. Sometimes I'd get a warning, sometimes I wouldn't. The notes were always short, written in that same neat script. "Don't look in the window tonight. Move the chair away from the wall. Don't go into the yard at 4:12. Each one left me restless, second-guessing every creak and shadow in my house. One evening in June, curiosity got the better of me. I decided I'd cross the street and just ask him what the hell he was doing. But when I got to his porch, the blinds were drawn and the house was dark. I knocked. No answer. The next morning, his chair was empty again. This time, it stayed empty. Days passed, then weeks. Grass grew long in his yard. The mailbox overflowed. One night, I saw a faint light in the kitchen, but when I looked again, it was gone. Eventually, a for sale sign appeared out front. But no one came to look at the place. It sat there, still and quiet, while the sign weathered in the sun. Sometimes, when I wake before dawn, I catch myself looking at that window out of habit. Every so often, I swear I see the outline of someone sitting there, watching me. There's no notebook in front of them, just empty hands resting on the table, waiting. Story 4, The Back Fence. Whistling. When I bought the little cabin on Hollow Bend Road, I thought the quiet would be good for me. The last few years in the city had worn me down. Sirens, traffic, neighbors screaming at each other through paper-thin walls. Out here, there was nothing but the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the porch boards. The place sat on a half-acre of land, surrounded by thick woods, with only one neighbor, someone who lived behind the tall grey fence that ran along the back of my property. That fence was a strange thing. 8 feet high, no gaps, weathered to a dull silver grey like it had been standing there for decades. I never saw anyone tending it, never heard the sound of hammer or saw. But it stayed solid, no boards missing, no paint peeling because there was never any paint at all. It gave the feeling of something meant to keep the world out, or in. In the first month, I didn't think much about whoever lived back there. I was busy with repairs, fixing the leaky roof, patching a warped section of floor, replacing a busted porch step. The woods stayed quiet, except for the occasional sound of deer in the underbrush or a fox crying at night. Then, about 3 weeks in, I heard it for the first time. It was a soft, meandering whistle, low and slow, like someone humming without opening their mouth. The tune wasn't anything I recognized. It didn't follow the usual rise and fall of a song, just drifted, notes hanging too long in the air. I was sitting in my living room reading when it started, faint but clear, coming from beyond the fence. I froze, book halfway down in my lap. It was past midnight. It went on for maybe a minute, then faded. I told myself it was just a neighbor passing time, maybe someone sitting out on their porch. But the next night, around the same time, it came again. The same drifting tune, the same pace. Over the next week, it became a ritual. Always late, always faint, always slow. Sometimes it would start and stop, like whoever was whistling was distracted. Other times it would run straight through for 5 or 10 minutes. I found myself listening for it, leaning toward the back window when the hour got late. One evening, I decided I'd try to catch a glimpse of whoever it was. I turned off all my lights and stood at the kitchen window that faced the fence. The moon was bright enough to make out shapes in the yard, but the fence cast a deep shadow. The whistle began, and for a moment I thought I saw movement, a faint shift in the dark, but it was too quick to tell. I stayed there until the sound stopped, and all I could hear was the distant rustle of leaves. The first real chill came on a night when the wind was sharp, and the trees tossed like restless sleepers. The whistling started as usual, but this time it was closer, louder, like the person had moved right up to the other side of the fence. I could hear the pauses where they took a breath. Then, between 2 notes, there was the sound of wood creaking, like someone leaning their weight against the boards. I felt a prickle along the back of my neck. My hand tightened on the curtain, ready to yank it shut. The whistle carried on for another 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly, like someone had clamped their lips shut. I didn't sleep much that night. 2 days later, the storm came through. Hard rain, wind that howled through the gaps in the siding, thunder rolling in from the hills. I was lying in bed, listening to the branches scrape against the roof, when the whistling started again. Only now, it wasn't faint. It was right there, clear enough that I could hear the whistle vibrating in the person's throat. And it wasn't coming from behind the fence. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The sound was coming from the side yard, on my side of the fence. The wind was driving rain against the windows, but underneath it the tune wound on, each note placed with the same slow care as always. I reached for the flashlight I kept by the bed, clicking it on with a trembling thumb. When I stepped into the kitchen and pointed the beam toward the yard, the whistle stopped. The light swung across the wet grass, catching nothing but the fence, the trees beyond it, and the sheets of rain slanting sideways. I took a step toward the back door, then stopped cold. There were footprints in the mud, bare feet. The prints came from the direction of the fence, then veered toward the house, toward my bedroom window. I followed them with the light, my breath caught in my throat. They stopped just short of the siding. No turn, no return path. Just gone, like the person had vanished right there. I locked every door and window that night. In the morning, when I went to look, the footprints were gone. Not just faded from the rain, gone like they'd never been there. The ground was smooth. I told myself I was tired, maybe seeing shapes in the mud that weren't there. But I didn't quite believe it. The whistle came again 2 nights later. I was in the living room, lights low, when it began, this time from inside the house. It wasn't loud, just a faint thread of sound, but the acoustics were wrong. It wasn't muffled like it would be if someone were outside. It was sharp, like it was drifting in from the next room. I didn't move at first. My skin felt tight, every hair standing on end. The tune went on for maybe 15 seconds before it stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound had. When I finally worked up the nerve to check the house, every door was locked. Every window was shut. The next day, I walked the perimeter of the fence. It stretched straight in either direction until the trees swallowed it. The boards were smooth, no footholds, no gaps at the bottom. I pressed my ear against it once, but all I heard was the wind in the leaves. I tried to tell May, the woman who ran the tiny store in town, but she just gave me a look I couldn't read. "If you hear it again," she said, "don't answer it." I didn't know what that meant, and she didn't explain. The whistling never stopped after that. Sometimes it was behind the fence, sometimes it was in my yard. A few times it was in the house. Always the same slow, wandering notes, always late at night. Last week, I woke up to find my back door wide open, the lock still set from the inside. On the kitchen table was a single, muddy footprint, just one. And that night, when the whistle came, I didn't wait to hear if it was inside or out. Story 5. The Locked Greenhouse. I moved into the old Coleman house in late October, the kind of move where most of your boxes stay unpacked for weeks, because the days are short, the air is damp, and the work of just living eats up most of your energy. It was a modest place, paint peeling in places, but the porch had a view of the ridge, and the backyard opened into a patch of woods. The road was quiet, just a stretch of cracked asphalt running along the base of the hill. There were maybe 7 houses scattered along it, each one spaced far enough apart that you could go days without seeing anyone if you kept to yourself. 2 houses down was Harold's place. You couldn't miss it, not because it was kept up nice, but because of the greenhouse. It squatted in the far corner of his yard, made of old wood and glass panels that had all been painted over in thick white. Even the door had no gap to peek through, just layers of peeling paint sealing the light out. I never saw him out there during the day. The first time I noticed him tending it was around 11 at night, when I couldn't sleep and stepped onto my porch for some air. He was hunched over, flashlight clenched between his teeth, working the soil around the base of the building. I remember thinking it was odd, but harmless. Maybe he was one of those eccentric gardeners who just liked the cool of night. The next morning, I ran into him at the mailbox. Wiry guy in his late 50s, skin the color of old paper. A little stooped, like he'd spent too many years bent over something. He had eyes that didn't sit still, like they scanned over everything once, then came back to you in quick, darting glances. We exchanged the usual small-town pleasantries. I asked him casually what he grew in there. He stopped moving for a fraction of a second before saying, "Things that shouldn't see the sun." Then he smiled like he thought it was funny, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. We went our separate ways, and I told myself he was just being quirky. Weeks passed. Every so often I'd see Harold out in his yard after midnight, sometimes carrying bags of something into the greenhouse, sometimes hauling out buckets and setting them by the door. Never opened them, never left them out for long, just in, out, and back into his house with that same quiet purpose. No one else on the road mentioned it. In fact, I rarely saw anyone else at all. The neighborhood had that worn-in, keep-to-yourself feel. People here didn't gossip unless it was about someone already long gone. One night in early December, a storm rolled in. One of those heavy, wet Appalachian storms that rattles the trees and makes the air smell like wet leaves and iron. Around 1 a.m, the power flickered and went out. I lit a couple candles and sat by the window, listening to the wind and rain. Through the sheets of water running down the glass, I saw Harold's greenhouse lit up inside. Not from a lamp or flashlight. This was brighter, whiter, almost like the flicker of an old, fluorescent tube. I couldn't see much through the painted glass, but the light swayed and shifted like it was coming from a single bulb moving back and forth. That was the first time I noticed the sound. Low, almost too low to hear at first. A kind of wet, rhythmic rustling, like someone dragging a heavy sack across damp soil. It went on for maybe 5 minutes before stopping abruptly. The light blinked out. I didn't sleep much after that. Curiosity has a way of gnawing at you. For days after, I found myself glancing toward that greenhouse every time I stepped outside. I'd listen for that rustling in the night. And then, one evening, when the moon was high and the air was still, I decided I had to know. It wasn't bravery. It was the kind of restless compulsion you get when something sits at the edge of your mind too long, scratching at the door. Harold's yard was soft from recent rain, my shoes sinking into the mud as I crossed the space between our houses. The greenhouse loomed larger up close, its paint cracked like old skin. I tried the door first, locked, of course, but near the bottom, where the wood frame met the concrete foundation, there was a narrow gap, not wide enough to see much. I moved around to the far side and found what I was looking for. A place where the paint over one of the glass panes had bubbled and peeled just enough to leave a thin, ragged slit. I crouched and put my eye to it. The first thing I saw was the bulb, a single bare light hanging from the ceiling, swaying slightly on its cord. The second thing I saw froze me in place. Between the rows of tables and planters, something was moving. It was stooped, its back oddly rounded, and its arms, or what I thought were arms, were too long, the elbows bending a little wrong. The coat it wore was unmistakable, brown canvas, frayed at the cuffs, same as the one Harold had been wearing when I saw him that morning at the mailbox. But the head was down, and the way it moved, jerky, deliberate, dragging one foot as it stepped, wasn't like any walk I'd ever seen. It reached out with one of those long arms, touched the dirt in a planter, and then turned slightly, just enough for me to see that the shape of its face under the hood wasn't quite right. Not deformed exactly, just wrong in a way I couldn't place. My breath fogged the glass. I stepped back before it could look my way. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying it, trying to convince myself it was just Harold with a bad posture, or maybe wearing something bulky, but the proportions were off. And there was the smell. When I'd crouched by the greenhouse, I'd caught a faint whiff of something under the damp earth and paint. Sweet, but spoiled, like fruit left too long in the sun. The next day, Harold wasn't outside. No trips to the mailbox, no lights on in his house. That night, though, I woke to a sound at my back fence, a slow, steady scrape, like something hard being dragged along the wood slats. I stayed in bed, telling myself it was a branch in the wind. In the morning, I checked and found fresh mud smeared low along the boards, and something else, 4 shallow grooves in the wood, spaced too far apart to be from an animal. A week later, Harold's truck was gone. No one saw him leave. The greenhouse stayed locked, but the smell seemed stronger now, even from the road. One afternoon, I walked by and saw faint handprints in the grime around the door, not quite where a normal person would place their hands, lower and turned in slightly, like the wrists couldn't bend the right way. The last time I saw light in the greenhouse was 3 nights ago. Same bare bulb, same swaying motion. I didn't go over this time. I stayed at my window, watching. And just before the light went out, I saw a shadow cross the glass. Tall, hunched, its arms hanging low at its sides. It stopped, as if it knew I was there, and the swaying bulb stilled. I haven't seen Harold since. I don't know if he's gone, or if he's still in there with whatever I saw that night. Sometimes I think I hear that wet rustling under the wind, even when I'm inside with the windows shut. And yesterday, when I came home from work, there was a thin line of damp soil on my porch, leading up to my front door. Story 6. The hollow-looking man. I first noticed him the morning after the moving truck pulled away. His place was directly across from mine. A squat, weather-worn single story with peeling paint the color of old sage leaves. The kind of house that had been standing long before any of us moved to this part of the mountains. It was quiet for a day or two after he arrived, and I figured maybe he was still unpacking. But then I saw him. It was earlier than I'd usually be up, and I'd stepped out onto my porch with a cup of coffee just as the fog was thinning off the slopes. He was standing in his yard, wearing a dark, oversized coat that hung too long in the sleeves. The way it draped over him made me think of a kid playing dress-up in his father's clothes. Only he wasn't a kid. He was tall, but there was something diminished about him. Not hunched exactly, but like his frame didn't fill his skin all the way. He was staring straight toward the mountains, past the houses, past the power lines. He didn't move, didn't fidget or shift his weight. I thought maybe he was admiring the view, but there was no softness in the way he looked at it. It was as though he was waiting for something to come down from there. Over the next week, I kept catching him outside at strange hours. Sometimes right before dawn, sometimes long after dark, always in that same spot in his yard, always looking toward the ridge. One evening at the gas station, I asked Ronnie, the clerk who'd lived here longer than most, if he knew the guy. Ronnie shrugged like he didn't care to know. "The place has been empty for nearly 4 years, he said. "Folks don't usually stay long in that one." When I pressed, he just gave a short laugh. "Guess you'll see why soon enough." Then he rang up my coffee and didn't say another word. It was maybe a week later when the weather turned. The power went out just before sunset. A storm rolling in from the west. The sky churning that weird green before the rain hit. I lit a couple candles and tried reading, but the wind kept pushing through the eaves, whistling in a way that made the house feel less like shelter and more like it was quietly leaking something in. At some point, I wandered to the window. The rain was hitting in waves, and every so often the lightning would throw the street into stark relief. That's when I saw him. He was standing in his yard again. No umbrella, no hat, just letting the rain soak into that too big coat. The wind was tearing at the fabric, making it cling to him, and in one flash of lightning, I swear, I saw his face. It wasn't right. It wasn't just gaunt or pale. It looked pressed in, like someone had pushed their hand flat against soft clay where his features should be. His cheekbones were too close to the skin, his mouth barely more than a straight line. And the eyes, set deep, too dark, like the sockets had been carved out further than they should go. I remember actually stepping back from the window without realizing it. The thunder hit a second later, shaking the glass, and I told myself I'd imagined it, just the light and the rain distorting him, but I didn't look again. The next morning, I was still half asleep when a knock came at my door. I opened it without thinking, and there he was. Up close, he didn't look quite so hollow, but there was still something wrong about the way his skin seemed to sit on his bones, loose in places, tight in others. He smiled, though it was more a movement of his mouth than anything that reached his eyes, and the whole time those eyes didn't blink. Not once. "Power out at your place last night too?" he asked. His voice was polite, almost pleasant, but low, like he was trying not to let it carry. I said it was, and he nodded, glancing over my shoulder into the house before meeting my gaze again. Just thought I'd check in. Nights like that can be unsettling. We made a little more small talk, but it was all surface level. When he finally left, I realized I'd been holding my breath without meaning to. That day, I tried to put it out of my mind. But at dinner, I noticed I kept glancing at my own front door, like I was waiting for another knock. The unease had settled in too deep to shake off. The next few nights, I started seeing movement at the edge of my vision when I'd go to lock up. Small shifts in the shadows near my yard or across the street. Once, I swore I heard the sound of shoes scuffing wet gravel. But when I looked, the street was empty. Then came the second storm. The power cut out again, almost exactly like before. I was standing in my kitchen, candlelight flickering off the walls, when I heard it, a slow, deliberate creak from the back of the house. My place isn't big, and the floorboards don't make that sound unless someone's walking on them. I grabbed the flashlight and turned it toward the noise, but the beam cut across nothing but the hall. Still, my skin was crawling. I kept moving, slow and careful, until I reached the back door. The lock was still bolted, but on the glass there was a faint smear, like a handprint dragged down through condensation. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I walked out to get the paper and saw him again, standing at the edge of his yard, this time looking not at the mountains, but straight at my house. When he noticed me, he smiled again, the same polite, too small movement of the mouth. And then he went back inside without a word. A few days later, I stopped by the diner on Main to see if anyone else knew more about him. Old Mrs. Green, who's lived here since before the bypass was built, just said, "Some folks come to these mountains to disappear. Some come 'cause they've already disappeared. If you take my meaning." I didn't, but I didn't press her. That night, I saw a light flicker in his house for the first time since he'd moved in. Not the warm glow of a lamp, more like a thin, white beam moving slowly from room to room. I told myself it was a flashlight, but the movement was too smooth, too steady, like it was searching for something with absolute certainty of where it would be. The night after that, I woke to another sound. Not footsteps this time, but something lighter, like the brushing of fabric against a wall. I sat up, heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. Through the thin slit in my curtains, a shape stood at the very edge of the streetlight's glow. Tall, still, facing my house. The coat hung loose again. And for a moment I thought maybe it was him, but then it shifted in a way that didn't match a person's balance. It seemed to fold slightly, like there was less inside it than there should be. When I looked again, it was gone. It's been 3 weeks since then. He's still there, across the street, though I don't see him as much during the day anymore. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the faintest creak on my porch steps, but by the time I look, nothing's there. The mountains are quiet this time of year, but I've noticed he doesn't stand staring at them anymore. Now, his attention seems fixed here, on my side. And a few nights ago, I woke up to find my front door standing wide open. Story 7. The Screams in the Crawl Space. When I moved into the little white house at the end of Ridge Lane, I wasn't looking for excitement. I'd left the city for quieter nights, slower days. Ridge Lane was exactly the kind of place people talk about when they say they want to get away. There were only a handful of houses, all spaced far enough apart that you didn't have to wave at your neighbor unless you wanted to. The air was still at night, the roads dead by 8, and the loudest thing most mornings was the sound of crows shaking the frost off the trees. The house itself was nothing special. Small, 2 bedrooms, a leaning front porch with a swing that looked like it had survived a tornado or two. But rent was cheap. And the landlady didn't ask many questions. The only real oddity was the place next door. It was another 1-story, almost identical to mine, but greyer, paint weathered down to bare wood in spots, roofline sagging in the middle. Whoever lived there never seemed to come or go. In my first 2 weeks, I didn't see a single light inside. No car in the driveway, no mail in the box. I figured it was vacant. Then I started hearing the noises. It began about a week after I moved in. Around midnight, lying in bed, I caught the faintest sound under the hum of the wind. At first, I thought it was a dog whining somewhere far off, but it would rise and fall, stop for minutes at a time, then start again. The second night, I heard it more clearly, muffled but closer. A kind of low wailing, broken up like whoever was making it had to stop and catch their breath. Ridge Lane wasn't the kind of place where you expected to hear people in distress after dark. The nearest bar was miles away, and the locals didn't seem the type to start screaming matches in the yard. I told myself it had to be the wind slipping through old siding, the way an empty house sometimes sounds alive when it settles. But it kept happening. A week in, the sound sharpened, no longer a wail, more like short, ragged bursts. And once, as I stood in my kitchen with the lights off, I realized it was coming from the direction of the grey house. I considered knocking on the door, but it was late, and something in me balked at the idea of walking up to that place at night. Instead, I lay awake listening, straining to make out details. Sometimes it was just noise. Other times, I could swear I heard words buried in the sound. That's when I started to notice the gap under the neighbor's porch. It was barely visible unless you stood at the right angle from my driveway, just a low, rectangular opening cut into the skirting at the base of the house. A crawl space, the kind you'd only use if you had to work on plumbing or wiring. That's where the sound was coming from. I tried to shake it off. Old pipes can make strange noises. Animals can scream in ways that sound disturbingly human. And the mountains, well, the mountains have a way of bending sound so you can't tell where it's really from. Then one night, I couldn't take it anymore. It was late October, the air cold enough to sting your lungs. I was up late reading when the noise started again, louder than usual. The voice, because by then I knew it was a voice, was frantic. Words tumbled over each other, breaking into panicked breaths. I stepped out onto my porch, the boards creaking under my weight, and just stood there, listening. The sound was clearer outside, definitely coming from the crawl space. I walked down my steps, heart thudding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. The grass was wet with dew, soaking through my socks, but I barely noticed. I crossed the short stretch between our houses, stopping a few feet from the grey porch. The voice stopped. The sudden silence felt heavier than the sound had. I crouched down, peering into the black mouth of the crawl space. It was too dark to make out more than a few inches past the opening. My breath clouded in the cold air. Then, from deep inside, I heard it again. My name. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't even loud, just a steady, deliberate whisper, drawn out like they wanted to be sure I understood. They said it twice, then fell silent again. I stood frozen for what felt like a full minute before backing away. My legs felt hollow, like they'd give out if I tried to run. Back in my house, I locked the door, checked the windows, and sat in the living room with all the lights on. I didn't sleep until morning. The next day, I drove into town under the excuse of buying groceries and stopped by the hardware store. While paying, I asked the clerk, an older guy with a thick beard, if he knew who lived in the house next to mine. He gave me a strange look before answering. That place used to be the Lamberts. Ain't been anyone in there since last winter, far as I know. The guy that was renting it just left, didn't even take his furniture. The sheriff had to call a cousin to haul it out. I asked why. He just shook his head. Sometimes people get it in their heads to leave. Can't say I blame him. I wanted to press him, but he'd already moved on to the next customer. That night, I kept every light on again. The voice didn't come. For the next few days, it stayed quiet. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Then, one evening, I got home from work and noticed something strange in my yard. In the dirt just off the porch, there was a perfect handprint, too large to be mine, fingers spread wide. The soil was damp, and the edges of the print were sharp, fresh. I stared at it for a long time before going inside. The noises returned 2 nights later, louder, closer. I couldn't make out all the words, but my name kept cutting through. Every time I heard it, the hairs on my arms stood up. By then, the fear had twisted into something else. Curiosity, maybe, or the need to know whether I was losing my mind. I waited until the next night, when the sound started again, then grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The beam cut across the grass, over the fence line, and into the gap under the porch. The light caught on something, pale and smooth, gone as soon as I blinked. I lowered myself to the ground, pressing one shoulder into the dirt to get a better angle. The crawl space was maybe 3 feet high, filled with shadow. I swept the light across the packed earth, the dangling insulation, the pipes. Then the beam landed on a face. It was pressed almost flat against the far wall, half hidden by shadow. The eyes reflected the light in 2 pinpoints. The mouth was moving, slowly, like it hurt. My name again, each syllable deliberate. I scrambled back so fast I dropped the flashlight. It rolled, casting the beam in wild arcs until it landed on the grass beside me. When I looked again, the crawl space was empty. I didn't call the police. I don't know why. Maybe because I knew how it would sound. Maybe because some part of me was afraid they wouldn't find anything, and I'd be left wondering if it was all in my head. The noises came every night after that, always from under the porch, always saying my name. It's been 3 months now. I don't go outside after dark anymore. I keep the curtains closed, the doors locked, but it doesn't matter. Last week, I heard it again, clear as if it were right behind me while I was in bed. I turned over, and the sound wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was coming from under my floor. Story 8, The Lights That Followed Me Home. The fog was thick that night, thicker than I'd seen it in years, the kind that turns every streetlight into a glowing orb and makes the edges of the world disappear. Driving in it always put me on edge, but I'd stayed late in town that evening, and by the time I started the drive home, the valley roads were already swallowed in white. I live out at the end of a long, twisting ridge road, past the quarry, past the last set of gas station lights, past anything you could call public. On a clear night, it's 20 minutes of dark, quiet driving. In fog, it feels twice as long. You can't see more than 20 feet ahead, and the road curves like it's trying to shake you loose. About 5 minutes into that ride home, I noticed the headlights. I'd just taken the turn past Miller's Creek when I saw them in my rear view, 2 small circles of pale yellow, hazy through the mist. They were far enough back I couldn't make out the vehicle, but close enough that I could tell they were following the same line I was. I figured it was just another late-night driver heading home, maybe someone from the quarry's night shift. But the thing was, they stayed exactly the same distance behind me. I slowed a little, they slowed. I sped up, they sped up. It happens sometimes on these roads. People nervous about the curves keep pace with someone ahead of them. But something about the rhythm of those lights in the mirror made my hands tighten on the wheel. The fog pressed against the windshield like a solid thing. my wipers made that soft squeak as they brushed away condensation, and the yellow glow of those headlights pulsed faintly every time we rounded a bend. I tried shaking them by taking a side road I don't normally use. It's narrower, with more switchbacks, and I thought maybe they'd keep going straight, but they turned right with me, their lights still hovering in that exact same spot in my mirror. It was then I started thinking about who it could be. Out here, you get to know the shapes of people's vehicles. Rusty's old Ford, with its one dim headlight, the Thompson's minivan. But these lights, they were too clean, too perfectly matched in brightness, and the glow was pale, like an older truck's sealed beam bulbs. By the time I hit the gravel stretch leading to my property, I was certain they were following me. My road is private. You don't end up on it unless you mean to. The headlights stayed steady all the way down the narrow one-lane cut through the trees until my house came into view at the end. That's when they slowed and stopped. Right there at the edge of the clearing. I pulled into my driveway, killed the engine, and sat there for a second, watching through the rear view. The truck, because now I could see it was a truck, sat there idling, headlights pointed right at me. The cab light flicked on, and a figure stepped out. It was Mr. Crane. I've known Harold Crane my whole life. He lives 2 parcels over, runs a little firewood and small engine repair business out of his garage. Quiet man, not unfriendly, but he keeps to himself. I've bought chainsaw parts from him a few times over the years, the kind of neighbor you wave to from your porch but don't really sit and talk with. But that night, he didn't wave. He didn't call out. He didn't even move toward me. He just stood there beside his truck with the headlights still on, watching me. The fog curled around him in the glow, turning his outline into a ghostly shape. I couldn't make out his face, just the brim of his cap, the bulk of his jacket. We stayed like that for maybe 20 seconds, me in my car, him standing perfectly still. Then I got out, nodded toward him and said, "Evening, Harold." He didn't respond, just stood there. I walked to my porch without another word, unlocked my front door and went inside. I figured maybe he'd had too much to drink, or maybe he was having one of those spells some older folks get where they just lose track for a minute. I didn't want to push him if something was wrong. When I peeked out the window a few minutes later, his truck was still there. He was gone. I didn't see any movement in the yard. The headlights were still spilling across the clearing. Eventually, I went to bed, telling myself I'd check on him in the morning. But in the morning, the truck was still there. The fog had burned off by then, and I could see everything clearly. His truck sat in the exact same spot. The headlights were still on, though now they were dim from the drained battery. The driver's seat was empty. I walked down the gravel to check, half expecting him to be sleeping inside. But the cab was cold. No keys in the ignition, no sign of Harold anywhere. I thought about calling the sheriff, but out here, a grown man disappearing overnight doesn't set off alarms right away. Folks wander, they hunt early, they go visit family and leave their truck for days. Still, something about it felt wrong. I ended up walking over to his place that afternoon. His garage door was closed, the windows dark. The only sound was the wind in the trees and the creak of his porch boards when I stepped up to knock. No answer. I left, telling myself he'd turn up. That night, the fog rolled in again. Around midnight, I woke to a soft glow through my bedroom curtains. At first, I thought it was the moon, but when I peeked out, I saw headlights again, down at the end of my driveway, in the same spot his truck had been the night before. I couldn't see the vehicle itself through the fog, just the lights. They didn't move. I stood there at the window for a long time, watching. The longer I stared, the more I realized the beams didn't look quite right. They didn't throw shadows the way normal headlights should. They were softer, more diffuse, like the glow was suspended in the mist itself. Then, just as I was about to step back, They flicked off. The clearing went black. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Harold's empty truck. The next day, I decided to check the crawl space under my house. I don't know why. Call it a gut feeling. The hatch is in the back, a low wooden door with a padlock I never use. When I got there, the padlock was gone. The door stood open just enough to show darkness beyond. The smell that came out was cold and damp, with a faint hint of engine oil. I crouched down, peering in, nothing but shadows and the crisscross of old beams. But then I heard it, faint, almost too quiet to notice at first. Breathing. Slow, steady, and close. I slammed the hatch shut and dragged a cinder block in front of it. I don't care if it sounds cowardly. There's a difference between curiosity and walking into your own grave. That night, I sat in my living room with the lights off, watching through the front window. Around 1 a.m., the headlights came back. This time, they weren't at the end of the drive. They were halfway up it. No engine noise, just two pale orbs floating in the fog, slowly inching closer. I backed away from the window and didn't look again until dawn. By then, they were gone. Harold never came back. The sheriff eventually filed him as missing. People around here like to tell themselves he wandered off into the mountains. Maybe he had some kind of breakdown or decided to go live with kin out west. But I know better. Some nights, when the fog comes down heavy, the lights come back. Sometimes they stay at the edge of the trees. Sometimes they creep right up to my porch. And once, just once, I swear I saw a figure standing between them, still as stone, watching me through the glass. It looked like Harold, or what was left of him. Story 9, the chair in the attic window. The house next door had been empty for as long as I could remember. Folks around here didn't talk much about it, just called it the Oliver place and left it at that. Paint peeled in wide curls from the clapboard siding, and the roof sagged in the middle like the whole place was exhaling its last breath. It had that look an abandoned building gets, where even in daylight the shadows inside seemed too thick, like they're pressed against the windows, watching. That summer was hot enough to make the air shimmer above the road. The cicadas screamed all day, and the nights felt heavier than the days. That was when I noticed it, one afternoon while mowing my front lawn. I happened to glance up toward the Oliver house's attic window. A rocking chair was sitting there, plain as day. It wasn't fancy, just old oak with one armrest darker than the other, like it had been handled a lot. I knew it hadn't been there before. I'd looked at that house 100 times out of idle habit and never seen a single piece of furniture. The thing was, every few days it'd be in a different position. Sometimes it was angled toward the east, like whoever had been in it wanted to watch the sunrise. Sometimes it faced the back of the room, toward the dark wall where the shadows clung deepest. Once, it was angled just enough toward my house that I couldn't shake the feeling someone had been watching me through that glass. I told myself wind or raccoons or maybe a squatter was moving it around, but deep down I knew it wasn't any of those things. That attic window didn't even open, not without breaking the glass. A week later, a storm rolled in from the mountains. The wind came first, bending the trees and filling the air with the smell of wet dirt. By nightfall, rain hammered the roof and lightning stitched the sky. I was in the kitchen making tea when the power went out, and the house fell into that strange silence you only get during outages, where you can hear every creak and groan of the wood settling. I stepped to the front window and, almost without thinking, looked toward Oliver Place. A flash of lightning lit up the attic. My breath caught. Someone was in the chair. They weren't moving, just sitting there, perfectly still, hands resting on the armrests, head turned toward me. I couldn't make out the face, just the dark hollow where the eyes should have been, and the way the shoulders seemed too narrow, like the skin barely stretched over them. Before I could process what I'd seen, darkness fell again. I told myself I'd imagined it. The mind can play tricks when it's primed with unease. I even laughed under my breath, trying to convince myself I was being stupid. But then another flash lit the sky. This time, the chair was empty. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I went out to check, thinking maybe the storm had knocked something loose, and that was what I'd seen. But when I looked up at the attic window, the chair was gone entirely, not tipped over, not pushed aside, just gone. That was strange enough. But what made my stomach tighten was what I saw on the roof. Muddy boot prints. They started at the attic window and went across the sagging shingles, heading straight toward my side of the property line. The prints stopped above my own bedroom window. They were big. Not huge, but too large to belong to a child, and the mud was still damp enough to smell like the riverbank. I tried to laugh it off again, but it didn't stick this time. My house felt different after that. At night, I kept hearing faint creaks above my bedroom. Not the kind an old house makes settling in the cool of night, but the slow, steady rhythm of weight shifting on floorboards, like someone moving back and forth in a chair. Sometimes it stopped when I listened too hard, as if whoever or whatever it was knew I was awake. 2 nights later, during another bout of rain, I woke up to a sound I can still hear in my bones. It was the long, drawn-out creak of wood bending under someone's weight, then easing up again, rocking back and forth. I lay there, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between each sound. It went on for what felt like an hour. I didn't dare get up. Eventually I must have drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. The following morning, I checked the attic in my own house. It was empty, just dust and insulation. No chair. But the smell hit me immediately. Wet earth and something faintly metallic like rust or blood. That smell lingered for days. I thought about calling someone, police, maybe, but what could I even say? Hey, there's a phantom rocking chair moving between attics and staring at me in the night. They'd tell me I needed rest. Maybe I did, but even now, weeks later, on certain nights when the wind is low and the world feels too quiet, I'll hear it again. That soft, deliberate creak above me. Like someone's still up there, waiting